Hello, and welcome to another episode of Just Keep Writing.
Podcast for writers.
By writers.
To keep you writing.
I'm Nick.
I'm Sameem.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Will.
And discussing this week, the four of us is the third draft from Refuse to Be Done by Matt Bell. Now, this is our last episode. I gotta know, before we jump into anything, how have you guys felt about these episodes and this book, specifically to your current writing processes? Gabe?
Oof, it's been so damn helpful. Like, to be honest, it's helped me unlock so many parts of my process and realize things that I might have figured out by myself, but this was just so useful. So I'm excited to discuss this with you guys, because I know I'm gonna get some good nuggets from you.
Will, what have you taken away from this book so far and in these discussions?
I'll tell you. Sorry, everyone. We have the giggles. It's the second draft I really took away about, like, actually rewriting it, which I know, like, in our other episode, like, most of us were all like, like, I didn't like it wasn't for me, but I actually enjoyed it because it actually kind of helped me work through the second draft. So that's really what I took away. And also just to listen to everyone's process of how they do things. So there you go.
Sameem?
I mean, the book is called Refuse to Be Done, which it seems like my novel wants to be. So I feel like I've sort of like learned a lot about that along the way, just like the challenges and sort of finishing and hearing everyone else like hear about where people struggle in different areas and sort of relating or learning what I'm going to encounter that I haven't encountered yet. It's been really helpful for me.
I like that. I think, so for me, I'm going to go with what Will said too. The second draft was actually probably the most beneficial for me right now. Just because it gave me a clear direction on how to start revisions and things like that. Because I think, and we'll discuss a little bit further tonight, I think part of everything that I've always done is I've tried to sprinkle in the third draft into all my other revisions at the same time. And I think, not knowing what you're doing, works with that. Well, let's jump into the third draft, right? So this is going back to the second guiding principle of the book, which is refuse to be done. So this is the point of the book where Matt recommends that you stay in your book, in your project, for as long as possible, which is the opposite of the gap between the first and second draft, right? Taking a break. This is the one where you don't stop editing and doing stuff until it's done. And Matt goes through a couple different tips and tricks and things like that, different skill sets and things to add to your tool bag. One of the ones I wanted to ask you guys is, how do you edit? Do you edit on a screen or do you print everything out and go line by line? Sameem?
I like printing. With short stories, I was like relatively straightforward to like print a draft or two. After finishing the first draft of the novel, I ponied up the money to actually like get it printed. And it was worth it. Like, I was sort of like struggling with spending the money on that. But otherwise, I think there were several months where I thought I could read on my laptop or an iPad or something like that and get through it. And I didn't. I just like wasn't willing to like sit down and focus on it or concentrate on it. But as soon as I got it into printed form, it just felt more like a book. So something that like I could actually sit with for a long period of time. And it just made it easier for me to like put everything else away and isolate myself with it for longer periods and read through it. And then also just like write on it, take notes, put in like tags and stuff like that. So just having it be more tangible is really helpful.
Will?
I print it out almost all the time when I need to like re-look at it, reread it, because it feels more real to me if I print it out. And I also don't get intimidated writing stuff or making notes, because sometimes when I'm looking at the screen, all I keep thinking is, I can't do this. So printing it out really helps me.
Good change of pace and mindset there. I like it. Gabe?
I've tried printing it out. It just, I mean, it's been weird, and weirdly, the thing that worked for me in that similar technique is reading it in Kindle, because that's how I read most of my books now. Physical, it's Kindle because reasons, but it allows me to to do the bookmark thingy and then go back, and I have the list of bookmarks. Like it feels like a balance between Microsoft Word and printing it out, like physical pages, because it's like if you're working on Google Docs, you can see all the comments on the right side. Like you put a comment and then you see the thing and where it lands on the document. And with Kindle, I can bookmark things and then go to my list of bookmarks, and then I can jump to the page that I put the note, because you can also jot down notes, like this sentence, this note. So it's like that helps me as a hybrid between like Google Docs or Microsoft Word and the printed. But also with my novel, I haven't reached a point where I think that the physical manifestation of the book will help me the most. So yeah, it's like given on the draft that I am, and given how Matt puts the number of drafts, like I would be at maybe like draft 4 right now in my work. In my mind, that was what I had, which would like be parts of draft 2 and 3, as Matt puts it. So I think I'm not yet at that point where I think the physical copy will help me.
I did want to add in, I had a couple years ago, I got one of those e-ink tablets. So the one I got was a Supernote, but there's also like the Remarkable. And they're really cool and really useful to sort of like a lot like reading on a Kindle, but there's a pen too, so you can jot down notes, you can bookmark things and stuff like that. So it's super, super useful. But for the type of weird brain that I have, I will just obsess about all those features and want to keep playing with it and not focus on the story. Whereas I do something similar even when it's like paper, where I'll like, let me get the coolest pens and highlighters and like the right little like note tags and stuff like that. But I get to focusing more quickly. But I have like friends who use Remarkable or Supernote, and it makes them ultra more efficient about going through the draft and collecting the notes and things like that. So they're pretty cool too.
I like it. Now, let me ask you guys this, and I don't know if anyone else is going to feel the same. I feel, for me, what's helped a lot is clearly defining which draft is which draft. What are you doing in each draft? Now I'm looking at it, kind of what you were saying, Gabe, right? Oh, I'm on draft 4 or 5, but it's like, is it really draft 4 or 5? Or is it a continuation of the first draft and how Matt has that outlined, or continuation of the second draft? Because as I've worked with Will on my own novel, I realized I've done a first draft for the last 2 years, year and a half, right? Thinking this is my second draft. No, I'm still in the first draft section. I'm still adding to plot and character and stuff like that. How has your guys' mindset changed in regards to like draft versus revision versus where you're at and how you look at that? Anyone can go.
I think for me, it has given me so much more structure of actually being conscious of what to do and what stage. Because that's like what you're saying, Nick, that's exactly what I went through, and I'm still going through a bit with my novel. I finished that 0 draft, and in my mind, okay, that's first draft. Now I'll go back. I mean, this was years ago. I'll go back and now start like looking at the sentence level, the paragraph, when I didn't know shit, basically. So now, like, this book would have been so damn useful in the before times for actually like showing me, because even though I've listened to so many authors, so many writers like talk about like their process, this is for real like the most like pragmatic approach that I've seen of, okay, this might not be exactly what works for everyone, but I think this is the most general process that I've seen that could work for most people, in that sense of delineating what is what and where to spend your time. Because even your real first draft, you're going to the sentence level, paragraph level, and in the language, you're gonna just, you're practicing that, but you're just wasting time, quote unquote, if your thing is to have this finished manuscript to be able to sell. If that makes sense. So it's also that intention, because if you're enjoying that first draft and playing with sentences for years and years and years, and your goal is not to publish that like in a timely fashion, like that's what you should do. Like that is, if that is your goal. So this gave me so much structure in my non-structured kind of process.
I like it. Sameem?
Yeah, I think that I think thinking about it as a draft sort of feels like it's a page 1 to page X sort of deal, and then once you're done with that, that's the draft. But I think to your earlier point, it's kind of like, instead of draft 1, 2, and 3, it's more like phase 1, 2, and 3. And so that, like, page 0 to 200 or whatever, isn't necessarily like the end of draft 1. It's just like a piece of phase 1. And I think that's like a for me at least, is like a better way to think about it. I also feel like, if I remember right, the draft 1 is like going through it without too much planning, and then draft 2 is unpacking what you did, outlining it, and then rewriting it. But what I'm realizing as I'm going through that sort of like unpacking and replotting and outlining and stuff right now from the first draft, is that feels very much like it's still part of that first phase. And I think phase 2 for me is when I will actually start writing the prose based on that new outline with the plot figured out. Because that planning, I know you sort of are probably going to keep reworking and replanning throughout, but that feels very much like a first draft phase for me.
Yeah, I like that. Will?
I think, I don't know if my mindset has changed per se, but I always viewed drafts as like the discovery part and laying out the groundwork. Even if you're someone who outlines or does a hybrid, your draft is really about figuring out voice, figuring out, who the characters are, what are their motivations, what kind of story is this forming. And then a revision to me is really like looking at what you have and then saying, okay, how can I deepen this? What do I need to make this feel either more immersive, or what do I have to add to deepen the work that I've already done? So like, to me, a draft is like surface level, figuring things out. A revision is like the deeper work. It's like really going in and saying, okay, how can I world build better? How can I really make my characters shine? Do my characters sound like individual people? That to me is revising, because you have pretty much, the surface level stuff, and now it's your chance to revise it, to like deepen it, to really like hone in on what the real essence of the story is.
No, I really like that. It's definitely different than just having 3 drafts to work on that one, but it works in your favor, right? One of the techniques that Matt does talk about, which is something I've been told more often than I probably should, in the revision process and redrafting process. So after you've decided if you want to do either paper version or digital version, right? He talks about reading aloud often, reading your work aloud. I want to know the success and failures that you've had with this.
I'll go first. I actually really like reading aloud because it tells me how clunky my dialogue is or how clunky my writing is. And actually, I really like when someone reads me my story. It really helps me figure out how people are reading it and what do I need to do to get the rhythm of the language down. So I like that. I think that's a really good way. But I tend to not do it unless I'm completely at a point or like I'm never doing that in the first draft. It's something I'm going to do like in a second or third draft where I really like listen to it. And what I think I'm going to try too is actually to record myself reading a chapter and then re-listening to it as well. That'll really help.
Gabe?
I mean, I've tried it. It's so weird because also like at the stage that I'm on, I suppose it's like not yet the place to do it because it's not really, as I said before, it's not really the first draft that I'm on. So I've done it with this second phase. I think the way Sameem put it, I liked that. Like instead of saying draft, like just the phase, like the phase that I'm at, like this second, I've done it at holy shit, the cringe that I've experienced. And I think that is also part of what shows you like, oh my, yeah, it looked good on paper. Now that you hear it, it's like, oh dear Lord, like this is how I would write at 12 years old. So it was good when I tried it because it slowed me down. Because, I mean, English being my second language, I read way, way faster just with my eyes than I do out loud, like exponentially faster. So I think it slowed me down and engaged a different part of my brain. Also, I mean, being audio, that's obvious, but it was really, really useful for learning, really, for learning a bit of craft, not really like to apply it for the draft, but it's mostly because I used it not at the correct phase, if that makes sense. Like I know when I'm at that last stage, it's going to be way more useful than it would, but it was useful on a different way.
I like that. Sameem?
When Will said he especially likes having someone read his work back to him, I felt like he was like a king on a throne demanding someone in his court, like, read this back to me. That part again.
This is so accurate. I can like actually see this in my head.
But no, I agree with what everyone said. I think I've only done this with short stories, but it's usually like one of the last things I do after it's been through all the drafts and everything like that, and I'm like reading it out loud to find like the clunky sentences where there's too many words, where the rhythm and the pacing is off, or where like that's when I think you really hear like, oh, these two characters sound the same. I need to do something to like differentiate them, things like that. So yeah, not too much to add.
I'm actually going to say I like the idea of what Will said is having someone read it to you, because I have failed at this so many times. I have read all my works aloud to myself and I still terribly mess it up. And I think part of it is because my brain autocorrects everything for me as I'm reading it, and I don't always catch everything. And it's probably the most frustrating lack of skill that I have. But now hearing that, Will, like, you have someone read it aloud, I'm like, make my wife read it to me now. I like this. I'll start doing that because this is an area that I've always struggled with. And when people were like, "Oh, just read it out loud," it's like, guys, I have a problem with that. Somehow I autocorrect when I read out loud. Like I catch 90% of everything I do, but not everything. Sameem?
Yeah, I have the same issue where I'll fix grammatical errors without really realizing I'm doing it. And so one thing I've found helpful is like screen readers, like different programs, different operating systems have their own versions of like being able to read it back to you. When I've done that in the past, it's like, oh, this is annoying. It's a computer reading to me, but it does help. Now I feel like there's probably much better AI generated voices out there I haven't explored yet, but would sound more realistic and depressing in some ways. But if you don't have the luxury of having someone read it to you, I feel like there's other similar things you can do.
Yeah, I've played with that, and I don't want to pay the money for AI to read my story. So I'm stuck with a live human, I guess. So kind of jumping into a little bit more here, right? Let's actually talk about the editing phase. There's a section in the book where Matt is talking about breaking your prose into manageable chunks and taking it paragraph by paragraph, line by line. I wanted to know, kind of for you guys, what's worked best for you when it comes to editing your novels and short stories when you want to work on prose. We'll start with Sameem this time, and then Gabe, and then Will.
I don't know if I have. I mean, like I said, I've only really done this phase with short stories so far. And I think with short stories, I can read through this whole story front to back multiple times and then just decide on those reads where I feel like something isn't working and I want to drill into it more deeply. And often it is like a paragraph, like either reworking the sequence of sentences in a paragraph or breaking it apart, things like that. I think when I'm doing this for the novel towards the end, it'll be similar, but I feel like there's going to be the same thing on a larger scale where it's like whole scenes, whole chapters that I need to like resequence or split up and break them into pieces and go deeper into them. But I feel like just knowing the way my brain works, I don't think I'll be super structured to say like, hey, this is the atomic level that I'm going to go into and go by the piece by piece. I think it's going to be way more sporadic.
Yeah, I think I'm the same way because like for short stories and also for chapters that I've revised when I shouldn't have really, I feel like I do it in a way that I like. For years I worked translating from English to Spanish, Spanish to English, and yeah, obviously translation it's its own beast, but I would never do it like by paragraph. Like that's one of the parts that didn't resonate with me from Matt's method. Because yeah, if you could like each paragraph is like honestly it's like fed by the one before and the one after. And if it's a long paragraph, a short paragraph, just sentence, like all those things, like yeah, as you were saying, Sameem, going for the consciously for what's like the atomic level of each section. Yeah, I think everything. I would say that I go by like section of chapter of it. If it's a short chapter, the whole chapter. But it's also like everything's really connected. Like if you look at it like a school essay, like introduction, the body, and the conclusion, even though they're distinct sections, they all feed into each other. They all have their own, like to keep the voice. They all, and you might, I would think that if you're like looking paragraph to paragraph, you might even like repeat things more than you would like to. So yeah, like going that granular into the thing, it didn't like, I think that wouldn't work for me. Yeah, I mean, I might try it like I'm doing with so many things from this book. Like even though it looks very alien to me, sometimes like trying out something, it might unlock another piece of your process that you were not aware that you could have, like a little extra tool. But yeah, I don't know, I'll report back.
I want to make the distinction here that when Matt talks about breaking the prose into manageable chunks, he's not talking about style of prose or working your prose to be full, like your final sentences. It is about getting to the points where you're right, making sure the voice matched with everything, making sure that your style is there and things like that. So there is that distinction there that I just want to call out. Will, just to repeat the question here, how do you break up your revision into pieces that work for you, whether it's by sentence, by paragraph, by chapter? How do you start tackling that?
I don't know. It changes in every single thing that I do. You know, I have tried to I've been doing this with a short story that I'm rewriting finally. And I'm doing the outline of what the story is and what I want the story to do. And it depends what I'm working on, right? So this is all prose. This is if I'm writing short story or novel. For writing my play or any play that I'm writing, and then writing for comic books, it's different. You know, it's really like, because with a play, I have to really think about staging and what I want, how I want that. Like, I just went back and wrote in, now that the play's being finished, there's, I'll give an example. I have two characters that are meeting in this place that is, it's called the Nexus. It's kind of like limbo, right? But I needed to put in more stage direction to heighten the tension. So there is a clock that is set at 7 minutes, and each scene that they're in, I went back in and wrote that. So I knew I needed to do that bigger picture stuff. Then it's also, going through and making sure the dialogue and the beats are there with a play or comic book. With a short story, it's really thinking, am I getting the emotional hit that I want people to leave with? Right? So that's where, like, I think it was a really good idea to kind of outline where your book is at, right? And I'm going to start this with short stories because it'll help me guide me for when I'm ready to edit my novel this summer. Then I thought of, to break it down, I think it's going to be a learning lesson, with the novel, because there's a lot more to look at. So I can't say that I've done this with anything yet, but I will, starting with the newest novel. Like, I'm not going to go back and read some of my old stuff because it's just awful for the most part. And I know I'm a different writer and person now than when I've written that. So I guess it's to be continued. But if I compare it to the way that I make art, every project will be a little different. I don't ever expect me to have a full-on consistent system, because what I've learned with, like, drawing and painting, and even when I sculpt, yes, you're kind of getting these fundamentals of, like, all right, I'm going to look at this, but a lot of times every project is going to create another energy and a difference. Like, I don't work that way. Like, sometimes I have to let the energy move me to know how I'm going to break things apart. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I find, it's fascinating that once we get to this part, a lot of us have similar things that we do. And so it's almost like there's kind of a copy paste type way to do this in the final drafts here and getting everything moving forward. Now, I'm curious too, do you guys, quick answer here, do you guys, when you edit, is it scene by scene or is it chapter by chapter? You're looking at one chapter at a time or one scene at a time? Will?
I think the way that I've structured my novel that's in progress, a chapter is a scene. This is kind of like how I've been thinking of my work, especially because the play has really been informing me about, like, how I work creatively and what is giving me the most impact. So for me, I don't think I'm really, and I think Gabe actually can be a good resource to also kind of bounce back because he's read a lot of my work. I think my chapters are full scenes in themselves. I tend not to, like, break them up within the chapter. I tend to just end the chapter on something. And if I want to start, like, say, with another character, I make that another chapter, right? So I'll give an example of, like, Sarah J. Maas in a Throne of Glass series. Sarah will sometimes start a chapter with Selena, the main protagonist, and then she'll switch it to a different third omniscient or third limited person point of view of, like, one of the witches in one of the later books. And that will be a whole chapter. But when you look at that, she kind of mimics, she does this dance of what she's doing when you look at the chapter. So what do I mean by that? Selena's in a certain area. Something happens, that scene ends. She starts a new scene with the witch. That scene ends, a new chapter starts. And it could go back to Selena or it could go back to Kaol, who's, like, one of the guards, right? And what I've learned about that is about pacing. right? But for me, I think when I'm writing, and this is just so far right now, because I can almost guarantee you it will probably change because I'll want to have fun and I'll want to challenge myself. But right now, as being like an early writer and really starting to understand story, I think for my brain, it helps if I make a chapter, a whole scene, and then I start a new chapter. I see what Sarah's doing and I see what some other authors do. I just don't feel like right now, as like an early career writer, I'm ready for that because I feel like I'm just finally starting to understand story. I don't know, or it's like I'm understanding, but I'm recognizing it. So like this is another good example, I think. You know how when they're like, when you read a book, you want to study what's going on. Well, I can't work that way. And during me and Marshall's, if anyone had listened to that episode of like our creative research, what are our canon books, I said, don't think of anything when you're writing. Internalize everything. And so what I'm starting to understand, and I really believe that the podcast really has helped me with, is I'm starting to internalize more story than I ever thought I was capable of. Because through talking it with you, and this is where I think community is really important too, I think I do have a much stronger sense of story than I ever thought I did. So that's how I'm thinking of everything.
Well, thank you for all that. I like it. Gabe?
Oof, I'm trying to put it to words first, like in my brain of the way I edit, because the way I used to edit, it was more granular than I've mentioned that I do now. But honestly, I found that was not like the way that I should do it, and after gaining more experience, but also not being that experienced yet, I've noticed that, and even though it sucks and it's related to the adage of write every day, the thing, like, I need things to percolate in my brain. Even though I do my Excel sheets, even though I do all that practical way of analyzing things, and even if I have them laid out in front of me in cards in my Excel sheet, I still need my brain to be deeply immersed in the story. And I cannot do that if I'm not constantly looking at my stuff or even thinking about it. Because I cannot write every single day. Like, that's something I cannot do. For that, I hope someday or maybe never. But there's this analogy that just made like my brain burst of like a water pump handle. That you pump and you pump and you pump and there's no water coming out. Once the water reaches the top of it, now there's water coming out. If I relate this to that part of the process in the sense that if I stop pumping, the water's going to go down. And by pumping, I mean being with my story, looking at my file, thinking, writing, moving things around, like just being exposed to my story. And so if I stop a few days, thank you, Will, for that comment. That was magnificent. I will not say it in that's just for us. And so like if I stop being immersed, I find it so hard to edit. I find it so hard to keep things consistent or like build on the ideas that I had before. Like, it's the more information that my brain is working in the background or consciously, the better I can edit. And I can just move things around without that much thought of sitting like, where should I put this? Like, it comes more naturally the more that I'm with my story. So that's, even though it sounds like a bit more ethereal and less practical than I'm used to communicating, I've noticed that's the way that works best for my brain. Just have all the information, have time with the story. Because if I'm on that stage and I stop for a month, then I go back. It takes me 2 weeks to get back into that momentum, into pumping the handle until the water's coming out. So it's kind of nebulous, but that's how my brain works. I hope that made sense.
It does, but I also think you are someone who's very analytical. Do you know what I mean? Like, I know that the way you need to work is like, you need, like, Gabe's great at this because in our writing group, we read the first Greenbone Saga book, and this bitch over here was like, created a spreadsheet of like plot points, and this is what Fonda did here, and this is what she did here, and then I'm comparing it to what I have and what's here, and it's like that's how Gabe internalizes structure, right? And this is why, like, if you ever get the pleasure of reading his story, he's so great at characters, and you can see like that analytical self of how plot works in his work. So I really feel like it's like if you're someone who is analytical and sometimes getting back into your story is to create spreadsheets, is to do this, because I don't think that's wasted work. I know some people will think that's wasted, but I don't. I think that's a really great way to immerse yourself and look at story another way. I don't work that way at all, in the least. Like, I am like, to me, everything's about energy and feeling and abstract. But I also think on my day job, there are some technical things, but like even just me making art and everything, I'm much more of an intuitive person. It takes me a little bit more to be like analytical. So I think everyone's going to have their thing to get them back in the story.
And thank you for that, Will. You made me blush.
Right.
I love making you blush.
So I want to know, like, how you guys end a chapter. And what are you looking for in ending a chapter? This is something that on my end, I'm not going to say I struggle with, but this is something that like I've had a lot of misses on, but I've also had a lot of hits on. So when it comes to ending a chapter for you guys, when you're on this final rewrite, how do you know when that chapter is good to end? Sameem?
I feel like this sort of goes back to what Will was saying around like you kind of just feel it for the most part, at least like when I'm initially going through it. But I do think when you go back and look at a chapter that felt right in what happened without even thinking about it, there is this sort of like setup for what a character or group of characters are trying to do, and what happens with that attempt, and whether that means like it's a setup for another chapter or it's sort of like a conclusion to like a mini problem, things like that. And so there's this like, I don't know if I'm remembering this right, but there's like the structure of chapters where there's like a scene and sequel where there's like the setup for the scenario, and then the sequel is like how is that resolved for that finite chapter, and then what is it leaving on the table for like the next chapter. And so I think like if I thought about it too much in those terms, it would just turn out really crappy. But I think in terms of just like imagining how something should go and writing it out, when it turns out well, that is what it's doing.
Well,
okay. I always try to end my chapters with either a cliffhanger or a question has to happen at the end of that. I want the person to want to change it over, or something has to happen. So I've really been, and I think again, the writing my play has really helped me think of the novel and chapters as scenes, and each scene has to make you either I've answered a question and raised another one, or I have dropped a bombshell, and then I go to the next chapter and I don't necessarily answer it. I might start off with something else or a different character if I'm doing multiple points of view. So I try to raise questions, answer questions, cliffhanger to make it there, to make it like want to turn the page, or like a bombshell. Or there can be softer moments when something really like an aha moment for a character, or they learn something about another character that is just hitting hard emotionally. Because I think what you have to do, and I specifically think this works for science fiction and fantasy and like genre fiction, right? It makes you want more. So you need external and internal conflict. So that's really how I kind of look at everything, you know?
Gabe?
I mean, to be honest, like it's different things. For one, like I agree with what Sameem said. Like it's like firstly mostly by feel, and related to what Will said about just knowing story. You know, like being reading and reading and reading and just internalizing how story works and like the ability to put it on the page. But also, again, to the point of myself being immersed in my own story, it makes it easier to get that feel of what I should do in that moment. Even though I'm not doing it consciously, I always tend or aim to leave on a cliffhanger, but on different levels. Sometimes it is a huge, a huge hook, a cliffhanger that people have to turn the page. Like that is, like I cannot stop here. But in other times it's having a cliffhanger that's small enough that some people might be curious enough to like, okay, I'll do one more chapter. And others like to allow the reader to have a little rest. And I think that is also related to the scene sequel of allowing your characters to digest what just happened, which also tends to translate to how a reader perceives it. Like allowing this character to, oh my god, all this happened. Now they need this sequel chapter that's slower, related to the previous one, maybe slower on certain things, and maybe that chapter will not end on a huge cliffhanger, but enough of a question, enough of a cliffhanger that if you have the time, you have the energy to just keep going. Like not, but that is like firstly, but by feel, but obviously that like to analyze it deeper, that is on later draft, on the third parts of the second draft, maybe third draft, and that's when I use the spreadsheet to go deep into, okay, is this a scene, is this sequel, or how many sequels in a row, how many scenes in a row? So that's when I go more analytical, as Will was saying.
I like that. You guys are getting pretty deep on these, what I thought were like more light questions here. So kind of bring it back to the book and the chapter here. So this chapter, right there, I'm noticing a lot of the language that Matt's using is after you do a thing, do another revision, but now do this, now do this, now do this. And so like I'm trying to track it, and I feel like the third draft probably has 7 different types of revisions in there. One of them that's covered, a full revision on this is dialogue. Now, on a scale of 1 to 10, how often are you guys rewriting your dialogue, reading it out loud with either yourself or giving it to 2 completely different people to actually act out your dialogue for you? What are your guys' techniques with getting your dialogue dialed in? Will?
Well, Gabe likes to tell me a lot, and I do this a lot, so this was a good lesson. But he used to be like, yeah, this is a lot of like Maid and Butler. Like you're like, and as you know, and I always just want to like reach through the screen when we're having our meetings and punch him repeatedly in the face for that. Okay. Because I was like, it was brilliant. And then I realized he was right. So with my writing group specifically, which Gabe is in my writing group, I really do work my dialogue out more because it's when I first do my first draft, it's heavy in dialogue. I think so. Sometimes they'll be like, no, you're describing it really well. And I was like, I don't know about that. But so I do go over it after I give it to my trusted people. After that, I think it's more about like reading aloud. And I want to say this because you know what? This reminds me of when me and Sameem actually first met and we were reading my story. Once someone in our group, who I love, did say this to me. And he was like, some of the language was a little too modern for like science fiction and it took me out of the story. And now I realize that the person who made that comment is coming from a place of colonialism, is coming from a place of where language belongs. And I think the reason, and I thought that was like a valid, like, okay, like I wasn't like hurt. I wasn't clutching my pearls. I have a thick skin because at the end of the day, I'm going to do what the fuck I want to do. But when I read Kai Ashanti Wilson's book, which as anyone has never read his novellas from Tor, they're beautiful. He mixed modern language in this epic fantasy that was amazing. And I just said, it's all about context and character drive, right? And like what your world you're trying to create. Because something can sound, too hip or modern, but that's because they're basing it, I believe, on a very colonial way of how you're supposed to talk in science fiction. And I fucking hate that shit.
Sameem.
Yeah, I actually think there's dialogue where this came to me as I was like trying to fall asleep and I wrote it down and like that stays the way it's going to stay. Like it's much more organic. It's much more the way I want it to be. But sometimes there's dialogue that's just like, I needed the characters to get to this point in this conversation. And when I go back and reread that towards the end, that's where often it actually feels like, what Will is saying. It's like, this is language that based on what I've read and like predominant, like, old world Western science fiction, what I thought should be in there, not even science fiction, just in general, like this is the way people in proper books talk and that's what they should be talking like. And then I go through, I'm like, well, this doesn't sound like the characters, doesn't sound like me. And it's clearly just like filler language. So yeah, I don't know if that addresses the question. The question was like, how do we edit dialogue, right? Or like go through and revise dialogue.
Yeah, hey, you know us. We bring in what we can to every conversation. So I'm gonna kind of piggyback off of Will here. And I think this is super important when you are in this editing phase and you are having beta readers and things like that, is making sure, really trying to make sure that you're not getting feedback that's incorrect. So, I'll share a story of another author, right? They were rejected on one of their manuscripts that eventually got published. And the feedback from one of the rejections was, this is too black. And it's just one of those things like, I think when it comes to dialogue, that's inherently part of the story and things like that. I think your characters are going to come out a certain way and things like that. And like I said, Will's experience, and it just seems like it's a common thing. So whatever you do, don't take bad feedback. If you're writing in a certain dialogue, which, maybe a certain dialect or anything like that, and a way of speech, like just make sure you're very intentional with that and things like that as you do that. Sameem?
Sorry, this is semi-tangentially related, but that just reminded me of the time where I got feedback on a character's dialogue that said that the character didn't sound foreign enough. And it's like feedback that I knew I was going to ignore. I was luckily like at a mature enough point in my writing to like not take it seriously. But I think that's just another thing, like know when to take your feedback you get seriously or not.
Yeah.
100%. That's the horrible thing to say. Let me guess. I mean, I don't have to guess. I already know the complexion of that person's skin tone. And unfortunately, Marshall's not here to say anything, right? Like, I have seen people give Marshall feedback based on black characters in fantasy and kind of like just like snubbing the dialogue about it. And it's like there are some preconceived notations about certain genres, but I think it's one of those things with dialogue, like that makes or break a character. You can translate a character all you want through descriptions and stuff like that, but I feel like through dialogue, at least for me, that's really where my character takes roots. Will?
I just think if anyone wants a really great book to read that focuses on dialogue, Nilo Hopkinson's book, Midnight Runner, right? I think that's what it's called. We'll put it in the show notes. I can't talk, everyone. Show notes. That's like an excellent way because this is a Caribbean book. They're a colony that, they went into space and they were all from the Caribbean, from Earth. So there's such an interesting dialect, and it's such a beautiful way to see science fiction written that way.
Well, look, if you guys haven't finished this section, go out and finish it. We're finished discussing it, but that doesn't mean the fun isn't over with it because there's lifelong lessons to be learned from Matt Best, Refuse to Be Done. Guys, any last thoughts on this craft book and how it changed your perspective, your choices in life to edit?
No, I mean, I loved it. And I think I especially loved it for giving me permission to write for the first draft. And I think that's where the book spends the most of its time, right? Like, I think like more than half the book is talking about the first draft. And I think that was like, for me, when I discovered the book, like really helpful for where I needed to just like let go and start writing. I think where I need more help and maybe where like the book doesn't cover is like, how do you actually write an outline? Right. Like that's not something that Matt Bell is getting into in there. And I think there's other great resources for that. So he's telling you like, these are the things you should figure out how to do. But there's definitely other resources for it. But I think it was just like really eye-opening. And I think I appreciated how much wisdom he brought in from so many different people into the book, and different experiences. So yeah, it just like opened up the floodgates for me.
Gabe?
I mean, I thoroughly loved it in so many ways, but I think the biggest thing for me is as an aspiring author, not being as experienced as I hope I'll be one day, like first allowing me, like showing me that, yeah, that's part of the process. You gotta suck at some point. You gotta focus on this at this other stage, but also like showing me that like uncharted territory for me, like things that I have not yet experienced, and telling me like, yeah, this is what might happen, and this is one way or 7 ways to address it. Like, because so many things of writing, like the first time ever as a writer that you finish that first draft, there's so much more that you have no idea is going to happen. And it's so many ways that your brain has to shift gears, both like literally in life, the way you manage your time or the way you manage your own techniques, your own toolbox. So just showing me that, yeah, this is actually the way, and now this is the next stage. So like preparing me for that and showing me how to fight against that. I think that's my biggest takeaway of the book.
Well,
I would say I'm excited about the tools it's going to give me, and in the next couple months, I'm really going to dive down and really use some of the techniques more and more. So I'm really excited. I had a lot of fun reading this. And you know what I loved? I loved that, truthfully, it took us a year to finish this, right? I loved that we got the first draft. We kind of took the longest part on the first draft because I think that kind of happened because all of us were working on the first draft at the time. And now we all have work that we've completed and or like almost completed. And now we're like, okay, thinking of like the next parts of what our journey is going to be. So this was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I have to echo that. I started this last summer, I think. I read this before we decided we want to do it for the show. And this is, I think the biggest takeaway for me was like, holy cow, this is my writing style. This is what feels the most natural to me, especially in that first draft section. So I loved it. I took so much away from it, and I got validation out of it that I kind of knew what I was doing here a little bit. Not completely shooting fish in the dark there, but it's a great book. I loved it. It pairs well with the other craft books that we've done. If you haven't yet, go re-listen to some of our previous episodes with the not Refuse to Be Done, but Charlie Jane Andrews craft book. Never Say You Can't Survive. We also have done Mastering Plot Twists as well. I think all of these throughout the years that we've done them, they all kind of tie in together in just different sections and things like that. So if you haven't, go listen to those, listen to these. If you haven't picked them up, you got to pick them up. And as always, give us a shout out in our Discord, on our social medias, and sign up for our newsletter.
And this has been Just Keep Writing, a podcast for writers, by writers, to keep you writing. You can find us at justkeepwriting.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Feel free to reach out to any of us on our social medias, and please jump in our Just Keep Writing Discord channel. Links to all of that is in the show notes. Lastly, please support our show by going to patreon.com/justkeepwriting. We offer daily writing prompts, early access to podcast episodes, and much more. Thanks for listening, and just keep writing.